Hello and welcome to your very last notes on development, part 6, adulthood. We took our adolescence notes in class. Remember, you won't have any at-home lectures on adolescence, so make sure you know your books. But we're going to be finishing up by talking about adulthood. Pretty short, we're talking about the physical, cognitive, and then social aspects of aging. Okay, so let's start out with our physical changes of adulthood. Males, there's not a whole lot. We'll talk about some brain imaging or things with thinking and cognition in just a bit. But physical changes in middle adulthood really are going to have the biggest implications with women because women go through a stage called menopause. And menopause is a biological, so biologically speaking, it's when women stop to menstruate or have periods. Happens around 50. But menopause, I want you to think pause is like a time period. It's a time period where all of those changes associated with menopause. So this the well-being, so how a woman feels about herself, going through states of like anxiety or depression, hot flashes. So physical changes, mental changes are all considered menopause. It's a process, all right? So it's not something that's just like the period stops and menopause is over, but it often takes a couple years because there's hormonal changes. So women menstruate because they have hormones, and so those hormones stop being produced, and some things happen. So a lot of times the voice changes a little bit, mood can change a little bit, but not too much over that 10 period time, but it's more the physical changes associated with it. Okay, so physical changes later in life as far as for men and women. So women have been shown to live longer than men if we survey the age 100. So when babies are born, we're about a 50-50, right? There's 50% women, 50% males. By the time we survey 100-year-olds, so people that are 100 years old, we find that women outnumber men 5 to 1. So for every 5 women who are 100, there's only 1 male who is 100. So there's a book in your joke that looks at women are marrying older men, should really marry men about 5 years younger than them if they want to live to be the same age. Okay, so life expectancy is longer for women than it is for men. There is this italicized word in your book, you know I love italicized words, called death deferral. There we go. And death deferral is the phenomenon that's referred to that people actually die 2 days, or the death rate 2 days after Christmas is far higher than the death rate 2 days before. So that sometimes people, when they start dying or go through their and reaching into their life expectancy, often die, they kind of hold out for good positive things like Christmas and occasions, and are more likely to die 2 days after than they are to before. So that's called death deferral. We'll talk a little bit about health and how that changes throughout lifespan, but you should know that a person's health, they're not more susceptible to like short-term illnesses and things like that, but they are more susceptible to things like dementia and Alzheimer's. And we'll talk about dementia and Alzheimer's more in our abnormal psychology, especially dementia. But dementia, so 2 different things here. So dementia is basically the deterioration of the brain. So dementia can occur because of things like strokes and disease, but it can also just be the natural decay of the brain over time. So there's literally less brain or neurons in the brain with dementia. Alzheimer's is associated with memory loss. So we'll look at Alzheimer's a little bit more, and we've already talked about it with lack of acetylcholine when we talked about memory. All right, so some other physical changes that happen throughout life are things with senses. So you'll need to know all 3 of these. So your sensory abilities, you're going to look at 3 different things. So 20/20, so vision, smells, and then words, so verbal fluency. So we're looking at different ages for all of them. So your sight is really poor when you are, I don't want to say, when you are born, right? So sight is one of the last things to develop. Babies can only see a couple inches in front of their face, and then it gets to be better. But what you find is that the proportion of normal 20/20 vision when identifying letters on an eye chart, this peaks, right? So 30 to 50, but after, look what happens at age 70. You get a rapid decline in 20/20 vision. That's thought because of the things in your eyes that are keeping you focused, right? Your cornea focused often get stretched out, but people as they get older need glasses. Identifying smells, so the ability to identify smells, again, about age 20 is where it peaks. It stays pretty constant till 70, decline, all right? Don't turn 70. the moral of the story. And spoken words, so correct when identifying spoken words, we're talking hearing, right? So looking at your ears. This one declines a little bit earlier, so we start hearing going at about 50, at a rapid decline all the way down to 90, all right? So looking at those changes, so you need to know the senses that change over time, so sight, smell, and then hearing. Again, with hearing being the one that declines the most from peaking, and the other ones kind of level off and then go down at 70. Let's talk about some cognitive development. So memory, there's been a lot of stereotypes and just sayings out there that as you get older, you lose your memory. So because of those claims that people have been making, there's some research that's been done. So the first one is recall and recognition in age. So I'm going to do some numbers or some arrows here. So when asked to recall, so from a list of words, just like we did with our memory, as people get older, their recall ability decreases. Okay, but their recognition, so being able to pick out words from a list, actually remains about the same. Okay, so we get this constant recognition. The recall goes down, but recognition stays about the same. Their prospective memory, so when I say remember to get milk at the store, remember you have an appointment at 3, remember you need to take your medicine today. There's all these different things associated with prospective memory. So the remember to get things when they're triggered by events stays about the same. So their prospective memory stays about the same when it's events. I should have typed that in there. So we're talking about events here. Remember, you write that down. Time-based, though, so if I remember that you have an appointment at 3 o'clock, this tends to decrease. Habitual things like take your medicine, you need to do this every day, that tends to decrease. But our semantic memory, meaning that memory that has any type of meaning associated with it, we find that it stays about the same. Okay, so when we talk about memory and aging, you have to really kind of break it down to what type of memory. So recall does go down, recognition does not. Perspective memory, when we're talking about events, does not tend to go down. Time-based and habitual does. Anything with semantic meaning tends to stay the same. Okay, so memory is not this like this blanket, like their memory goes down. You have to really ask what type of memory. All right, let's look at some other things like intelligence. Oh my gosh, the lights, and it's really dark outside. Hold on, let me turn on the lights. Running out of time. Okay, so IQ, so intelligence, looking at over time. Again, the claim has been made that as people get older, their intelligence decreases, right? So we're looking at IQ here, intelligence over time. And there's different types of information found on whether, or from 2 different studies. You need to know what a cross-sectional study is versus a longitudinal study and the evidence that we see from it. So in a cross-sectional study, this is when I take the same exact test and I compare it across all ages. So here is an IQ test, and it doesn't matter if you're 10, 15, 20, or 90, you will take the same exact test and then they compare it across the board. So what they find with IQ in cross-sectional studies is that it decreases. So if here is my cross-sectional study graph, what they have found is that intelligent peaks, right, and then it goes down. So from that graph, I might be able to say that intelligence decreases as I get older, right? So with age, intelligence goes down. That's a cross-sectional study. Think about just like cutting through a cake, so crossing through a cake, right? You take everything. A longitudinal study is much different. That's where I take one person and or same people, and I track them over time and look at their intelligence. So when I look at IQ with a longitudinal study, I find something different. I find that their intelligence stays about the same their entire life. Okay, so intelligence is not just referring to knowledge and I want to say facts, but intelligence is actually a combination of skill and facts all put together. So cross-sectional, I do find that older people in general have lower IQs. Longitudinal, so think about longitudinal over time, I find that their intelligence stays about the same. So it really depends when we're talking about IQ on what we assess and how we assess, right? What we have found with IQ tests is 2 other vocab words you need to know. Lots of new vocab in this section. Crystallized intelligence versus fluid intelligence, you have a change over time. So when testing crystallized intelligence, think of like crystallized being like permanent. It's kind of my accumulated knowledge and verbal skills, so everything that are crystallized in your brain. We find that over age, our crystallized intelligence does not change, right? So we do not get a decrease in intelligence, crystallized intelligence. What we do find though is that we get a decrease in fluid intelligence. And fluid intelligence, think about fluid as kind of like moving in and out. It's our ability to reason pretty quickly and to think abstractly. So to think about like problem solving, new things. It's kind of like your working memory. You're pulling things in from the environment, plus your long term. Your fluid intelligence has been shown to decrease as we get older. Our crystallized intelligence has been shown to stay about the same. I'm going to find a way to fix the lights. They're going to go off again, I'm just warning you. Okay, so let's talk about socially then. So now we've talked about our physically, how we changed, how we changed cognitively, so memory and then intelligence. Now let's talk about socially. So you may have heard of something called a midlife crisis, and this is also referred to in psychology as a midlife transition. So socially speaking, when for people to be a certain age, mid-age, 40-ish, 50-ish, they start questioning, like, what have I done with my life? And they have this type of existential crisis, right? And a lot of the times this midlife transition or the midlife crisis is associated with something called the social clock. And the social clock is this socially accepted or culturally accepted time for these very important things like being married, having kids, retiring. So a lot of the midlife transition is dependent on where you fall into the social clock, so culturally speaking. So people from different cultures could have different midlife transition or midlife crises depending on what is accepted in their culture. I know I'm speaking fast. Pause it, write it down, rewind it. All right, so let's look at some other things socially that might affect old age. So love, there's been a lot of studies done with people who have been in love or married for their entire life tend to die pretty close together. So one of the biggest precursors of a death is the death of a spouse. And then here's a graph that looks at life satisfaction in the year of their spouse's death. So I don't know how they measured life satisfaction. We'll have to look at that. But if life satisfaction here, it actually decreases right before the death, so they know that they're getting ill or their spouse is getting ill, and is the lowest the year of their spouse dying, and then it gradually goes back up. We're looking at like 5 or 6 years before it ever gets back up to almost where it was before. So love plays a really important part in life satisfaction or where that person feels, and so does work. So a lot of people often tie in work. So what you do equals what you are is a quote from your book. But where does work play a part in our adult commitments and our social developments? Depends on the culture as well. Okay, let's look at some more social development, well-being across the lifespan. So what we have found with people who get older, especially after the age of like 50 or 60. So first of all, let's talk about our 80%. So well-being over the lifespan. Well-being, we find that about 80% of people at any time or any given age are saying that they're satisfied with their life. So 80% is kind of our norm. It doesn't change too much. It goes down just about adolescence, 20 years old, and it goes just a little bit above at about 60. But what we have found some really interesting things with the brain. So I don't know if you ever noticed, but your grandparents or older people tend to be a little bit happier or a little bit more positive. They might have less pressures. I'm just going to lecture in the dark. I'm giving up on the lights. They respond a little bit more positively to things. Now, this before was kind of looked at like, well, they've lived through a lot of things. They're just responding because they know like it could be worse. But what they've actually found in brains of older people is that their amygdala, so emotional part, actually responds less to negative images and negative news than it does to happy news. So it still responds to happy things, to positive things that happen in their life. It responds less to negative things. And even brain waves, when shown negative images, there's less brain activity when being flashed negative images than there is positive. So something goes on in the brain as people age that actually allows them to respond more to the positive, less to the negative. Okay, death and dying, awkward transition. Kind of go through the same things as people who know that they're dying and after death go through those bereavement stages. I'll give you guys that in class. But when someone finds out that they're dying, they actually go through denial and then anger. So kind of the same bereavement process when they find out that they're dying than after dying. Around the time of someone's death, right? So anger is the very first stage, or denial first, and then they feel anger. Anger peaks after someone close to you dies at about a month. The yearning for them or missing them peaks at about 4 months. And what they've actually found with people who are going through the grieving process is that groups are very helpful, but almost just as helpful as groups and therapy is time and friends. So time heals what wounds can we know? Open wounds. But that therapy and people that go through therapy and have these kind of group sessions heal at about the same rate as people that are just going through the natural bereavement, and that have close friends. All right, so I have one more biopsychosocial chart for you guys on aging well. I'm just going to skip to the end, so it's like aging successfully. So instead of going step by step here, and then you can pause it here and write it down. But when we're talking about successful aging, you're really putting in 3 things. Your biological influences. First of all, you have to have no genes or anything that's going to cause diseases or cause you to die early, and appropriate nutrition. Psychologically influencing, we're looking at so your outlook on life, your physical and mental active lifestyles. And then my social cultural on influencing well is how much support from your friends, your meaningful work and activities, your cultural respect for age, and your safe living conditions, right? So where you live, you feel safe. That is the end of our development unit. How does that feel? Okay, so we're done. You're done. You just died, right? We went from birth to death. In class, I'm going to give you a handout on reflecting on our 2 major developmental issues, nature versus nurture, and Erickson and Kohlberg and Piaget over time. All right, I will see you in class tomorrow. Goodbye.